Hello and welcome back to the Football Heritage podcast. I'm your host, Rory Bryce, and today I'm joined by Kal Singh Dhindsa. Kal, how are you doing? Thank you very much for coming on the show.
I'm fine, thank you. Thank you for having me today.
Not at all. It's a pleasure to have you on. Kal has joined us today to talk about the campaign that he's been running. You've been doing a bit of fundraising to restore the grave of Jack Kirby, who is, he's a former Derby County player, a very historic player, but it kind of ties into what we like to talk about on this podcast in terms of preservation of football heritage and actually campaigning for recognition for these players and people who played a huge part in the stories of our football clubs, but sometimes don't exactly get the recognition they deserve. So we're going to be talking a little bit about Jack Kirby's story today and the work that Kal's been doing, because it extends far wider than just this fundraising campaign. But before we kick things off properly, Kal, why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself?
So my name's Kal Singh Dhindsa. I currently work in an auction house, so I'm really into my heritage and history. I'm still a teacher, I guess, but I'm not teaching at the moment. I'm also an author, writer, and I have a big interest in football history, football heritage, and just heritage in general, especially around my local area where I live in Derby.
Brilliant. Yeah, I mean, as you said, working in an auction house, you're obviously going to be coming across objects and so many heritage items that play a wider role within your community, but also personal heritage and personal heirlooms and stuff like that as well. Was that how you came across Jack Kirby's story, or was this just through kind of personal research and other things? And, this is a good starting point because, we're going back quite a bit here now, aren't we?
Yeah, coincidentally, a couple of years ago, an actual album of that tour that Derby County went to Germany to play these German footballers during the Nazi period, it came into the auction, and there were pictures of Jack Kirby and the Derby County players taking part in these Nazi salutes. But I've known about Jack Kirby for a long while now. There were numerous stories in the local paper over the years written by my friend Anton Rippon, a Derby County journalist, reporter, and so on. And I've always been aware of Jack Kirby, and it was only this June that I went out looking for the graves of a couple of these Derby County players that I wasn't aware of where they were buried. And I managed to find Jack Nicklaus, who was also on that tour. He was buried in a Wollerton in Nottingham. I relocated his grave, you could say, because a lot of people were not aware that he was buried in Nottingham, even though he was born in Derby. And then a few days later, I went looking for the grave of Jack Kirby, the English Jack Kirby, John Jack Kirby, not the Marvel comic book artist, who also did not like the Nazis. But, it's amazing to think both these Kirbys have made a name for themselves because of their resistance to the Nazis. So, yes, I found Jack Kirby's grave in Netherseal. He was born in Overseal. I've written a poem about the incident. I won't go over that now, but last, I think it was on the 25th of October, I finally kicked off a GoFundMe campaign to raise about £1,500 to get this grave restored so that it looked as it did do when it was first put down. Sadly, when he passed away in 1960 at the age of about, 50 years old. He was very young when he died. And yeah, within a month, 25th of November, a few days ago, we managed to hit target, £1,500. And so many people have joined in with the campaign, not just Derby County fans. Newell United, his first club. We've had Villa fans also put some money in, because the very next tour after the Derby County tour of Germany was the Aston Villa team, who also made it difficult for the Nazis. They have their own story. So yeah. Jack Kirby was an inspiration to many, although at the time, back in 1934, when it happened, many people just thought, he's just a rude person. He didn't join in with the Nazi salutes. But, it all came to fruition with him. He knew that they weren't any good. And by 1939, invaded Poland, hadn't they?
Uh-huh. Yeah, and I think that's quite an important aspect of I suppose it kind of comes into this idea within heritage of remembrance, to a degree nostalgia, but more so remembrance and memorial. Obviously, we now have the benefit of hindsight, but at the time, a lot of these players who would have opposed fascism, whether it was in Germany, Italy, or Spain, so I know it's not universal, but they wouldn't have had the same sort of almost universal support and sort of interest around them as we do today, because obviously we see, for the most part, people see the fight against fascism as something that is ultimately good. But back then, it was a lot more complicated and a lot more mudded, and they wouldn't have had anywhere near the levels of support that they may have got now. And in fact, a lot of them may have even found themselves blacklisted from jobs. They may have found themselves getting sacked from jobs. It wasn't easy to do something like that, and it was actually a huge statement at the time to be able to do something like that, especially in front of crowds, politicians, officials. It was a big thing.
Yeah, what you've got to understand is that this happened in 1934, and the Nazis had only come into power 2 years previously. So they were very popular in Germany.
Yeah.
But when this Derby County team went over, they could see that this was a country gearing itself up for war. And although Jack Kirby may not have known all the terrible stuff that would have eventually happened with the Nazis and their discrimination and the prejudice against certain communities, he was the kind of chap that just thought, this isn't right, and I want no part of it. And although the other Derby County players did do the salutes reluctantly, hesitantly, he just turned his back and said, no, I don't want any part of this. And he was proven correct. And it's, in my opinion, it's one of the greatest acts of defiance in sporting history. In my opinion, it's quite remarkable what he did, and he inspires me so much. I mean, I remember when the August riots happened not too long ago in England. And I was worried at the time because I noticed on Twitter, even our own fans, Derby County fans, I saw elements of our own fan base engaging in this nonsense that was promoting hatred. And I thought, what are you doing?
Yep.
Derby County fans, football fans, there's a large mix of them. They're not all racist, but a large majority of football fans are generally good people that don't want any part of that anymore. And I saw this element creeping into my own fan base and other fan bases. And I tried to get the club involved and say, look, you need to put out a statement. We can't be having these fans saying these things and causing trouble for people like me, who look like me, and others. Because I'm not a Muslim myself, but I look like one to a racist. You get the point, right? I'm Sikh, actually. And my people have a history of standing up for the vulnerable and those that are easily targeted. So I got in touch with the club, and at first they said they weren't going to do anything about it because it's political. They don't want anything to do about it. But then things got really bad in some quarters, and they put out a statement saying any fan involved in this kind of nonsense, you know, you're heading for trouble.
Yeah.
And I was glad they finally got to do that. But it shouldn't be for people like me to tell them to do this.
Correct.
They should have realised that themselves. And that's why I tried to push Jack Kirby into the forefront and show people this is the kind of fella that we had in our community back in the old days. And this is the kind of people we need now to be looking after other people that are being targeted and discriminated. And Jack Kirby is synonymous with that to me always. And it's been the great thing about this all is I had no idea that any of Kirby's family was still alive. And through the process of kicking off the campaign, I've had his niece get in touch. I've had other relations. I've had relations that the great niece wasn't even aware of existed. And all these people have just come together. And that's what it's about for me. It's about taking a negative that happened so many years ago and trying to flip it and put a positive on it. Because a lot of those Derby County players, right, they didn't deserve that. And a lot of them probably would have felt that their careers were besmirched by that connection to the Nazis. We had Ralph Hahn, who did the Nazi salute. His daughter became Judith Hahn, who was a Tomorrow's World presenter on BBC for many years, right? We had Jack Nicklaus, who also engaged in that Nazi salute. 14 years later, in 1946, he won the FA Cup as a captain of Derby County Football Club. So it's his kind of atonement. So I wanted to atone these players that, you know what you did because you were following the government's protocols. You were following the clubs, the managers. But this chap, Jack Kirby, he stood up and turned his back on all that and said, no, I'm not going down this line. Not for me. No thanks.
And that's why the story is so inspiring at the end of the day, because... And it's weird because obviously, you know, there always is these kind of nuances to it. It's like, well, did they know what it was all about? Did they see what was wrong about it? Were they just doing what the club or the government said or whatever? But there's still always a choice. Whether or not you're being told about it, there is still always a choice. And that comes down to whether or not you feel it's right or wrong, or whether or not you're looking past what the Nazis were even at that stage. But it's crazy that now a lot of these stories are beginning to come back to the fore because there's been a huge rise in fascist sentiment. There's been a huge rise in racism. And as you said there, the August riots, a lot of football fans didn't want any part of it, but sadly, it's the loudest of the lot that do. And that's how they
Yeah.
end up making their voices heard, and everyone ends up getting, sort of tarred with the same brush. And this is why Jack Kirby's story is becoming more relevant again now. And, we've spoken about on this podcast before, we've spoken about Arthur Wharton, we've spoken about Andrew Watson, the first Black Scotland captain, we've spoken about Frank Sue a couple of weeks ago, whose story's become big recently. And the thing is, it's weird because these people deserve to have their stories told, but not to try and stem a new rise in fascism, basically. Do you know what I mean? So it's quite a weird dynamic that's going on. But of course, I think in terms of the stories, Jack Kirby, and his story, as you said, is just incredible, and it is one of the greatest acts of resistance that's happened within football.
Yeah, I'm so very proud. I'm aware of Frank Sue, Jack Leslie. I've worked with the people behind the teams that are trying to promote their stories for a while now. I mean, one of my friends, Andy Edwards, actually built the statue for Jack Leslie in Plymouth.
Brilliant.
So I was kind of behind the fact that I wanted to push him to make sure he made it, and I knew he'd do a good job. I mean, I've made so many statues and busts with Andy Edwards over the years. I could go on forever talking about him. I won't. But the point I want to make is that when Jack Leslie stood up and turned his back that day, he knew his livelihood was under threat, right? But he did it anyway. All those other players, again, they could quite easily have thought, that's it, that's our Derby career's over if we don't engage. One of our captains at the time, Tommy Cooper, who only played the one game, he was actually England captain at the time, right? So he only played one of the, I think, 4 or 5 games that they played in Germany. And he may well have thought, if I do the same as Jack Kirby, that's my England place gone. And to be honest, I think the next England game that he did play for, I think was his last, although he did do the salute. And he may have resisted during an England international. But he didn't have many games after that. And you do wonder why they didn't play again and so on. It's all speculation now. But the point I'm trying to make is Jack Kirby was one of the first who turned his back and said no. Later, there were stories that Stan Cullis, the ex-Wolves manager, did the same. But the thing is, he said he was not going to do it, but he wasn't picked for the next match. So really, Jack Kirby was the first. And he's become an instant legend over time, in my opinion. So when I saw his grave that day, when I finally found it, and I could barely read what was written on it, I thought, no, this man's grave needs to have his name seen again. Nothing elaborate, nothing extravagant, just have his grave polished, restored, get that name back in there and give people a reason to come to that graveyard, pay their respects and, pay respects to everyone else who's there. And just, share his story. And that's what it's all about.
Yeah, it has to be seen again. So tell us a little bit about the background of Jack Kirby's story and his life. Because obviously leading up to this decision, as you've kind of said, at the time he said, no, this isn't right. I don't want any part of this. And that's where his choice came in to turn his back on the salute. So what I was wondering was if there was anything from his background or life that actually inspired him to do that.
Well, he was born in Overseal in 1909. And I think one of his earliest jobs was as a coal miner, or he worked in the coal pits and so on. So he had these massive hands that helped him as a goalkeeper, right? So he had this community around him of hard-working miners who always looked after their people and did the right thing for all, right? So he eventually became a goalkeeper, played for Newell United, then went to Derby County. And he was just that kind of person that just wanted to look after his people and see them right. And when he saw discrimination, prejudice, persecution around him, he stuck his neck out and said, that's not right. So he was that kind of chap. I mean, in terms of a goalkeeper, he probably wasn't the best goalkeeper that ever played for Derby County or anything like that. But he had some real spirit within him to always try his best for himself, for his team, for his family, and look after his people. From what I've heard since the GoFundMe from his family members, he was a very honest, decent man who, even when he came into money at Derby County Football Club, he would look after his family, his friends, his community in the areas that he lived in. And that just sums up the man that he was. And it's so sad that he died very young at the age of 50, and he never got to see what's happened now, where people are thinking and saying, my goodness, what did this guy do? I mean, my poem basically sums it up. The fact that every one of those Derby County players put their hands up to salute, and he was like, nah, not for me, not having it, don't care. And that was Jack Kirby for you. And then you've got the other Jack Kirby, the American one, whose original name was Jacob Kurtzberg, I think it was. And he became a Jack Kirby. And he actually fought in World War II with the Americans, right? He's of Jewish origin anyway. I think his family were originally from Austria, but he was born in America. And he didn't like the Nazis either.
No.
And fair enough, you can understand why.
Yeah.
So in his first Captain America comics, he's got Captain America, which he created, smacking Hitler in the face. So Jack Kirby, the American one, didn't like the Nazis. And then we've got our Jack Kirby. And it makes you wonder, because our English Jack Kirby was actually born first, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this incident with our Jack Kirby happened in 1934. Could that have inspired the American Jack Kirby to think, Kirby's a nice name? Or I've got friends that have got the name Kirby, or they're coming from England.
Uh-huh.
It makes you wonder, where did the American Jack Kirby get his Kirby name from?
Yeah.
Was he inspired by the plucky Englishman from Derbyshire? But either way, it doesn't matter, because we've got two Jack Kirbys that literally smashed the Nazis.
Yeah, it's brilliant. And yeah, that's the thing. Did he inspire the American Jack Kirby to make that his name? It is really interesting, and there's got to be an explanation into the links there as well, because it would be some coincidence that there's two Jack Kirbys that just so happen to absolutely despise the Nazis and fight against them as well. It's absolutely incredible. But to go back to the English Jack Kirby and his upbringing, it's wild how many former footballers you find who were coal miners, brought up in mining communities, who turned out to be. And the thing is, I'm quite conscious. I don't want to put too much of a kind of left versus right spin on things. Do you know what I mean? But these guys all had the same sort of socialist worldview, which has kind of carried them and their memories into now. And this is kind of the thing, is that their opinions and as you've said throughout this so far, looking out for people has been the main thing, looking after their people. It kind of transcends politics and this idea of a political spectrum, because it's never as black and white as that, right? It is in some cases, but not always. But it's like these guys being brought up in the mines where there's this really kind of collective attitude. Everything's about helping each other, looking out for each other. It's absolutely incredible. Like Jock Stein, Matt Busby, the Shankly brothers. There's so
Shankly,
many of them.
Bellshill. Yeah, Hughie Gallagher was born in Bellshill.
Mm-hmm.
And through his first wife, I think he was kind of connected to Bill Shankly. But Hughie Gallagher was a miner initially. You've got Tommy Cooper, the ex-England captain and Derby County captain. They were miners. So you get these miners that were stuck underground for all these hours, and all they ever knew was the darkness down there and the camaraderie with their pitmen, right? And their families at home. And they knew they had to get out of these black holes and get into the light. And some of them use their talents as footballers to then go onto the football field, make lots of money, but do it in such a manner that they had the fans on their side. Because that player, that Hughie Gallagher, that Jack Kirby, was once one of them. And now that player is playing for these fans in the terraces, the miners, the industrialists, the industrial workers. And you don't see it now. It'll never happen now. You'll never get miners or anything like that. But back in those days, you had the likes of Gallagher, Kirby, Cooper, and, I wouldn't be surprised if Dixie Dean was hanging around the mines, and, all these great, great players, George Campsell of Middlesbrough in England, even Brian Clough. I mean, I think he could have gone into the steel industry in Middlesbrough, but it's quite amazing. Some of these players that were born in the early 1900s that had mining roots that then became exceptional football players, rugby players, maybe even cricket players.
Yeah,
and their legends live on because they were the original working class heroes. Just like Steve Bloomer, he worked at Lee's Malleable Castings as a striker. Not the football striker, but the striker of iron, no steel, with his father. And it's quite amazing, the stories of these original players, because I've done a lot with the likes of Bloomer and Gallagher in terms of my statue work, bus work. And it's just amazing how all these players are connected. Even Frank Sue and his wartime England caps. And he played with Stanley Matthews and all them. And it's quite amazing. These stories need to be brought out and shared. And every now and again, a statue is built for them, or a tribute plaque, or a bench. And I just think it's brilliant. And again, when those things happen, those statues get put back in the area where these players originally were born and raised.
Correct.
So a new generation of children will start thinking, my God, that's Steve Bloomer. He lived on Portland Street like me. He became a footballer. So can I. And that's what it's all about. This day and age, you kind of lose that connection between the modern day footballer, who they are, where they come from, and these people from the past. And, we need to make them links. That's why I always think that players of this day and age should spend more time in their own communities to try and inspire the younger generation, saying, I've done it, so can you.
Yeah, no, you're spot on. And what's interesting about that is that it all comes back to this idea of place, right? And if our listeners keep up to date with us on X and BlueSky, then they'll know that I'm continuously going on about place because it's so important to football. Not just stadiums, though. It's like that you said, players. Jockstein, where he worked and was brought up in an area called Burnbank, which is no longer there, kind of been built over in what is part of now the town of Hamilton in Scotland. But even though Burnbank's not there anymore, you can point to the street where his pit used to be and say to the kids in that street, by the way, Jockstein, this is where he was born, this is where he worked. And it's all about tying them to their place and what was there previously, showing them what was there previously, who came there previously. And if the street is still there that a former player was born on and lived in, even better. Do you know what I mean? It's about showing people that people from their communities done things that were incredible, and it can help empower them and stuff like that as well. It's an incredible asset that is very, very rarely tapped into and used by football clubs.
And why not? And why not put a plaque there or a bench there if the whole street's gone or the houses are gone? Put something there to commemorate the fact that one of the greatest legends in Scottish football lived there. That's where the seed was sowed for him to become what he became, and the football club that is there now because of the likes of him, and so on. And that's what it's all about for me. Things change, places change, people die, people move on. But these memories, as long as they exist, that person, that area never dies. And that's what it's all about. You have to remember the past, because only when you know where you've come from do you know where you are going in life.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think this is why the grave restoration is a hugely important thing as well, because it's one thing having a plaque, but it's a completely different thing to know and find and be able to see the resting place of this person as well. And when it's restored and, when there's a bit of a fuss made about it, then it makes it so much better for people. I mean, once, obviously, when Jack Kirby in that game took place, he turned his back on the Nazi salute. He decided it wasn't for him. Was his career impacted afterwards because of that?
No, I don't think it was, because he carried on playing for Derby till 1938, and then obviously war came in 39. Had he played for England, had he been the England goalkeeper and he did that, then naturally I have no doubt that he would not have played for England again, right? So if there had been an England international that did that for the first time, it would have been, right, off you go. We don't want none of your embarrassment. It's a bit like Jack Leslie. Once the FA found out he was black, it was like, no, we can't have his like on our team, and they brushed it away. And I'm sorry, I know I'm giving the FA a bit of a kicking, but they've made their mistakes in the past, whether it's the likes of Jack Leslie or in relation to other players and Asians like me. And sometimes you need to call things out for what they are and make people understand that back then it was bad. And if it's still happening now, where people are being, pushed aside because they don't quite fit the criteria to be in their group, then you need to do something about it. And that's what I like to do. I like to draw people's attention to these things and say, look, we need to do something about it. I mean, Frank Sue is great. I've got his little biography behind me here somewhere. And I read that a few years ago because my mate, Andy Edwards, the sculptor who made the Bloomer bus and everything else, he told me when he was a kid, his dad used to tell him that Frank Sue was his best ever player at Stoke, even though Stanley Matthews was playing there at the time. I'm like, Frank Sue, Chinese English? So I'll go home and Google him. And the amazing thing is, Frank Sue was one of my own, not just Asian, but he was born in Derbyshire, Buxton in Derbyshire, which is like North Derbyshire, right at the top. So it makes me, even though I'm not Chinese, I'm still British Asian like him. So again, that link's there. You might not think of it. You might look at me and look at Frank Sue and think there's nothing, you can't compare the two. But no, we're both Asians, we're both British. Why not be proud of that fact? And you've seen what Alan from your previous podcast with the Frank Sue segment, he was so proud. And when I find players like Hughie Gallagher used to live down the bottom of my road, and, Bloomer used to live on my street, and I've got all these football players that used to live around the corner from me. I mean, it's quite amazing when you find these things out and then you share them with people, and people are like, oh, I didn't know, brilliant. And or family members come to you and say, thank you for honouring him. We talk about him, but people aren't really interested. And in most cases, it's not that people aren't interested or that they don't care. It's that they didn't know in the first place.
Exactly.
And sometimes people get confused by the fact that just because someone's not talking about Steve Bloomer, it doesn't mean that they don't care. They probably didn't know who Steve Bloomer was. And once you tell them that, they're like, "My goodness, what? He was born in Cradley in the West Midlands, and he lived in Pear Tree. What? I used to live there. I used to live 2 doors away from him, or whatever." And it's only when you make these connections that these stories can then be shared with all.
Exactly. And it's about saying, like, and that's the thing, it's like the first step is telling people where these people came from, and kind of, I suppose, transcending what is just a name. Do you know what I mean? Because footballers to a lot of people are just names, and obviously we can see them in the TV now, but when we're talking about past footballers, a lot of the time it's just names that keep popping up and popping up and popping up. But it's about reminding people that actually these guys probably had jobs before they became footballers, even after, sometimes maybe even during as well. It's about saying, like, did this guy work in the same factory as your grandfather or great grandfather or whatever? Do you know what I mean? And it's the thing is, people don't realize how easy it is to do, because a lot of these guys grew up in industrial communities and worked hard just like we do.
Well, here's another example. Back in the 70s, Derby County had this brilliant footballer called Kevin Hector. Great goal scorer, played for Bradford Park Avenue as well. A couple of games for England, few games for England. Didn't quite hit it off because of the other strikers we had. But after Kevin Hector's career ended as a footballer, he became a postman.
Yeah.
He basically walked the streets of Derby delivering letters, as any other normal fan might have done as a job. And it's quite incredible. Once again, no footballer in this day and age, unless they've really fallen on hard times and not saved their money, you'd never find them going back to become a postman. Not that there's anything wrong with that. But my point is, back then, there wasn't the money in the game. They played it for the love of the game, right? Whether they be minors that became footballers, whether they became this and that, and then some, sadly, back in the 70s and 80s, again, when there wasn't much money in the game, they had to get new jobs, and they almost like blended back into the communities they came from. Hector wasn't born in Derby, but he'd lived here for so long, or around these parts, he kind of assimilated back into the community. And there's a lot of players like that, especially 70s and 80s players, who came in from places like Liverpool, like Roy McFarlane, came in from the northwest, and then came to Derby, and then ended up in this area and made this their home. And I just think that's remarkable, especially like when Brian Clough and Peter Taylor came to Derby as joint managers in 1967. They had a job to do. They made this their home for a brief period of time. And we were so proud that they were our own and they lived amongst us. Legends that lived amongst us.
That's the thing, because you don't get any of it at all these days. Do you know what I mean? I mean, like, and you get stories about guys that from the 60s and 70s that have come back from playing, they've become painters and decorators, and they'll just show up to people's house, start working on them, and you don't really get that kind of thing anymore. This is why people like Jack Kirby's stories are so brilliant, because they're relatable. And in this day and age, when footballers are becoming less and less relatable, particularly at the top level, it's something that can be really inspiring for a lot of people.
Yeah, I think in this day and age, football is becoming less and less relatable. My own football club, I know it's being run by a local fan, a local businessman now, but the vast majority of football clubs in the Premier League these days are owned by foreign conglomerates, big time companies that are only interested in the money. You've seen how certain teams have been somewhat, I wouldn't say corrupted, but the money has taken over. Chelsea, City, Liverpool, kind of that area around Liverpool, Anfield, where all those homes were. It's becoming like a Disneyland type thing. That's what happens these days, isn't it?
That's the thing, and there is another interesting dynamic in that, though, is that obviously Liverpool, in terms of the fans, are quite well known for what their worldview is and their political outlook is. But don't let that distract you from the fact that Liverpool, the club, bought up all the homes around the stadium, pushed all the people out of them, and then bulldozed them to create this new Anfield. And that is the problem with the modern game.
Yeah, I think sometimes, especially in this day and age, football, put it this way, Derby County Football Club now play at Pride Park, right? Previous to that, they used to play at the baseball ground in the Pear Tree Normanton area of Derby, where I used to live, where my mum still lives. Once the club went out of that area, that whole area just died.
Yeah.
Right? There was no longer the people coming into it to use the shops, to use facilities. It just became run down.
Yeah.
And it's just changed. And a lot of that blame could be for the fact that Derby County Football Club moved away from that area. But to be quite honest, had they stayed in that area, it would have ended up a bit like Anfield, quite possibly. You know, houses being knocked down and people being forced out. You would have had your own separate problems as well.
Yeah. So obviously with the success of the campaign around Jack Kirby, what's the future for your work with his name? Because surely you're not just planning to stop with the grave restoration.
No, I'm hoping that once the grave restoration is complete in warmer weather next year, that his name, his legend becomes more greatly known. Newell United have got this little display in their ground for him. Mickleover Sports Football Club put out a little banner. Don Amott, the other day, the chairman, put out a little banner of Jack Kirby, and fans will pass it and be like, what? And then Google it. Oh, my goodness. You know, so what I'm hoping is like clubs like Derby County, who he played for, might actually make use of it and say, look, we had that dark period in our history in 1934 when a lot of our players did the Nazi salute. But check out that guy on the extreme left, literally, who didn't put his hand up, right?
Yeah.
So share my poem, share that picture. There's nothing to be embarrassed, right? Yeah. Share the fact that Ralph Hahn, one of the players there, was the father of Judith Hahn, the Tomorrow's World presenter, who I used to love watching when I was a kid, and I became a science teacher, and only later found out that she was born here around the corner. I mean, it's only by scratching the surface do these stories come out. And then Jack Nicklaus, I mean, I now know Jack Nicklaus's son, right? Because I found his grave and we got in touch, and we talk all the time. We share photos, we share stories that he had never heard of, and I help people. And that's all I want to do. So in the future for me, I've found so many legends, right? Whether they be footballers or suffragists or like Ernest Townsend, the guy who saved Rolls-Royce in Derby during World War II when he camouflaged the factories to make them look like fields when he painted them, right?
Yeah.
I won't even go into that. My point is,
it's amazing.
I'm gonna carry on doing what I do and bigging up my Derby people, but not just Derby people, all the people. I am a Derby County fan, but first and foremost, I'm a football fan.
Yeah.
So if there's any fans out there that might need some help recognizing one of their heroes, it's irrelevant that I might not be a supporter of your team. If you need some help, then I'm willing to help you to make that bench, to restore that grave, to make that bust. Because I know the people now. I've been doing this for nearly 20 years. And I just want people to share my happiness in what I do, right? To make others happy. And in the process, maybe find, because put it this way, right? People could say, why didn't Jack Kirby's family do up his own grave? They could have done that. Yeah, sure they could have. But I know the circumstances as to why that hadn't happened, right? I'm not going to go into them. But sometimes these family members just think it might be a case of nepotism if they go around saying, I want a statue. Because people say, go and do it yourself. So it takes someone daft like me to come along and say, this is Jack Kirby, this is what he did, and this is what I want to do for him. And I'm not going to do this entirely on my own. I need your help, your help. That's why I bring everyone in. That's why I'm so happy that I've had Villa supporters on helping me, Forest supporters, Derby, Newell, Burton Albion, all sorts, right? Even there's probably some German fans that threw some money in, right? It doesn't matter. As long as you can relate to it and equate to it, I don't mind you coming in to our story and then sharing his story to a wider public. And that's what it's all about. It's about sharing history, heritage, and more than anything for me, local history and heritage, especially if it means some child who lives around the corner from me will think, oh, I know that guy. He's that guy who found such and such. That's what I want to do. There's a person who lived down the road from me. I think they should be more widely known. Well, let's do something about it.
It's incredibly important work, though, because you're bringing people closer to their football clubs, you're bringing people closer to their communities, the streets that they live in, the local myths and legends that are around them. Do you know what I mean? It's something that a lot of communities, particularly in places like Derby, are really missing at the moment.
There is. I mean, like I said, I've been doing this for 20 years. And what sparked me off was the fact that my father died by suicide in March 2006. And my life could have ended then as well. It almost did, in the sense that I'd given up on life. But I needed a spark to get me going again. And Steve Bloomer and Peter Seddon's biography of him, that's what sparked me into life, because I realized Steve Bloomer used to live on my street, literally down the road. He was one of my heroes. And all I wanted to do was share his story and build a statue to him or a bust. And I eventually was part of making that happen. And I've met so many brilliant people over time, especially the sculptor Andy Edwards, and we've worked on like Bloomer's bust, the Dave Mackay, the Clough and Taylor, Jack Leslie, the Beatles, Bob Marley. He's done all these statues, even Cilla Black in Liverpool, right? If you Google him, you'll be like, my goodness, because my dad died. He died by suicide. It should have been the end for me. But I used whatever passion I had to jump on, to almost piggyback on. And in the process, when I was remembering Clough and Taylor or Bloomer and making their families happy, thinking of their fathers, let's say, it made me think of my dad. And people would have said, oh, that's Kal. Not Kal, whose dad committed suicide. But no, that's Kal, who helped with that, who helped with this. I'm a Sikh. My people don't get buried. We don't have graves. We get cremated and then scattered around running water in the Punjab, in India, wherever you want to be, as long as there's moving water. So it's a bit odd that I go trundling around these graveyards and cemeteries looking for these people and then restoring their graves and helping. But I just find cemeteries wonderful places where there's so much life, never mind death, but there was so much life once there before it. And I just want people to remember that, you know, there's a lot of life still out there or that has lived their life. And sometimes some of these people have remarkable stories. And if you're going through a hard time, think of the likes of Bloomer or Marion Adams or Alice Wheeldon and the life they had and what they became. And they may have been, in some cases, not very well liked during their lifetime, but after the event, like Kirby, they've become legends after their lifetimes, proper legends. And I think sometimes we need to be aware of that, you know, that sometimes people do things that others might think a bit odd, but eventually it all comes round full circle and you realize they were right. And sometimes if you've got this gut instinct to want to do something, just go ahead and do it. Like me, if I want to make a statue for someone, I'll just go out there and say, this has to happen.
Yeah,
let's make it happen.
Yeah, that's the thing. And I think a lot of people forget that while graveyards are at the end of the day, they're a terminus, and a lot of people view them as a terminus sort of naturally, but they're also places of remembrance, and that's what they're supposed to be. They're meant to be places of memorial, and although obviously there's a lot of negativity attached to them because they're full of people's loved ones who've passed away, ultimately, because they're places of memorial, they should be happy places. And like you say, there is loads of life in them. That's kind of the point, you know?
Well, for me, you say it's a terminus, an end point, but for me, whenever I go into a graveyard, I end up stumbling across some random person that I then Google and research, and then the whole process kicks off again. Did you know such and such is buried at Nottingham Road Cemetery? And like, oh, we didn't know that. You know, it's coincidences, right? Coincidences only happen if you go out there, you walk about, you talk to people, you engage with people. If you're the kind of person that just keeps things to themselves and very insular and don't share stories, you can then not make that contact link with another person. Like sometimes I chat to someone, and the subject might go back to Derby, and they might say, "Oh yeah, I used to live in Derby. My neighbour was da da da," and you're like, "I knew da da da. He was my teacher," or something. It's a daftness of coincidences, but it's a greatness of it too. That the only way those coincidences happen is if you share these things, and that's why I love doing what I do. But sometimes I do feel, like you mentioned it before, that sometimes there are people in my community that actually get paid to do what I do, but then don't do it properly, or they don't want to get me involved because I'm a bit in your face and want things doing properly and immediately. And it's like, well, if you're not going to do it, I'll do it, right? And then they jump aboard. It's like, I don't even get paid for this. I just do it for the love of, you know, history and heritage and sharing stories. And I think, you know, if this podcast helps someone to go with an idea that they've had and think, you know what, I might just give it a go. What's the worst that can happen? I might fail, but at least I've tried. And sometimes you have to try to know if something is going to succeed. If it doesn't, fair enough. At least you've tried. There'll be no regrets. But the first thing you must always do is give it some effort to try and make it happen.
Yeah, I agree. It's all part of the journey as well. Just before we finish up, who is the next footballer that you're planning on remembering and bringing their story to everyone?
You know what? If you Google me, you've probably seen that I've done all the ones I wanted to do. The one I'm currently working on is Ernest Townsend, the legendary Derby painter who saved the Rolls-Royce factories. You know what? I'd like to do one of a female, maybe one of the earliest England female internationals, a lioness. I remember reading about one the other week.
There's Lily Parr, There's another one of the Dick Kerr ladies players as well. I think it's probably Lily.
There's one much later who played in the 60s and 70s, one of the official England, right? So I'm thinking I'd love to be involved in a statue for a female footballer, a trailblazer, right? Because I always go for people. Like I went for Hughie Gallagher. We still not got a statue for him. The reason he tends not to be put out there because people say, "Oh, that's Hughie Gallagher. He committed suicide in 1957. He was bad." But trust me, I know the family. I've done my research on Hughie Gallagher. He went through a really traumatic period in his life, and that death should not spoil his legacy, right? And so I always go for these people that are almost forgotten. I'm not saying Gallagher was forgotten, but Jack Kirby, who would have come across his grave in Netherseal, just by walking? They wouldn't have known. So I always go for these lesser individuals. I mean, my friend Andy Edwards has already made one for Alex Ferguson. He's done it in Aberdeen, actually. He did that in Aberdeen, right? So I had no concern for helping Alex Ferguson because I knew that one would be done. So I'd rather go for the likes of Peter Taylor, with Brian Clough, and these types of players. And I'm sure another one will come. Somebody might get in touch with me after this podcast and say, "Kal, we've got a legend at such and such football club. Can you help us get the ball rolling?" I'll be like, "Yeah, let's go." If you want to go down that route, do it. Let's go for it.
Let's do it. Brilliant. And I mean, if anyone is listening that wants Kal to work on something for them, whether it's research into a player, getting the recognition that they deserve from the club, then please do get in touch. This has been such a great chat. You can tell how passionate and energetic you are about this. And the thing is, within the industry that we work in, Kal Heritage, it's all very lack of funding, voluntary work, cold, dusty, damp shit rooms. Everyone's fucking miserable 100% of the time because of all these things. And we very much work in the industry that we do because we love it, and that can lead to exploitation. So it's so refreshing to see someone who's so excited and so happy about the work that they do and so just intrinsically and naturally wanting to pass it on to other people. I think the work that you do is tremendous.
Thank you very much for that. But I will say this, right? As happy as I am now, as euphoric as I get when things are achieved, there's also moments where you get so deflated when certain people who should do better, part of your own club or maybe other football historians or heritage lovers, do not help you, do not engage. So what I'm saying is, I might be a Derby County supporter, but make sure you're never insular and only keep it as that. Make sure you're always helping the Nottingham Forest fans, the Notts County fans, the Celtic, the Rangers, right? Don't allow your football allegiances, right, to hold you back from doing something. Because if you help someone, let's say if I helped a Forest fan, right, and their heritage projects or whatever, they might return that favour to either me or someone else who's a Derby supporter in the future. The moment we start blocking people and becoming gatekeepers, right, is the moment others will just not want to engage with you. And in that manner, we don't help anyone, right? I could go around big-headed and say, "Oh, I've made this, that, right? And list them all off. But at the end of the day, if I'm not willing to engage with all people and all football clubs, then there might come a time where people just say, right, we're not going to work with him again. And I won't get anything done. Yeah? I might get blacklisted.
Yeah, exactly.
So help as many people as you can. Make these connections, these coincidences. And you just never know what might come of it. If it makes someone smile at the end of the day, makes 100,000 people smile, then you've done your job. You've helped someone to reconnect with their family from the past who supported this team, supported this player. And it'll make you smile and it'll make them smile. And that's what it's almost always about. There's too much negativity, hatred, and division, especially when you go onto the platforms like Twitter that I've moved away from. I'm now on BlueSky, right? Find your people, find your community, and help each other out. Trust me, one day you might just need a favor back from them, and they'll be there for you.
Yeah. Yeah, no, you're spot on. I think that's the perfect way to wrap up this episode. As I said, it's been an excellent chat. It's ultimately that mindset that leads to things like the Frank Sue campaign, the recognition for Jack Kirby, and all of these other people that we've mentioned today. Cal, thank you very much for coming onto the show and dedicating your time to speak with us today. Once again, thank you to all of our listeners for tuning in. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. Very revealing and very inspirational from Cal's end as well, to see the work that he and so many others are doing to help us connect with our footballers and our communities again. Of course, if there is a topic that you want us to discuss, please do get in touch. You can email us at hello@footballheritage.co.uk, or you can DM us on X or BlueSky on X. That's @_footyheritage. On BlueSky, it's footballheritage.bsky.social. But for now, Cal, say goodbye.
Goodbye. Thank you. Thank you very much.
And it's a goodbye from me as well. We'll see you all again next week. Goodbye.